Reading the Sherwood Ring by Elizabeth Marie Pope. We're starting on page 113 in a new chapter, The Bean Pot. Peggy! Yes, Uncle Enos, I murmured dutifully, but not enthusiastically. It was a warm afternoon, and I was very comfortably stretched out in the cool library after a long horseback ride over to New Jerusalem to call on Pat at Mrs. Dykeman's. Mrs. Dykeman, all of a flutter, had given us iced tea on the side porch, with thin watercress sandwiches and a superlative currant cake, which she said had come down in her family from the time Eleanor Shipley gave the recipe to her great-great-great-grandmother. Her name was Martha, Mrs. Dykeman had remarked, and the recipe was a present from Miss Shipley when she went away to get married after the Revolution. You never told me that, Mrs. Dykeman, Pat reproached her from the hammock. His arm was still in a sling, and Mrs. Dykeman was keeping a careful eye on him. The fact is, I'd forgotten it till this minute, she said apologetically. I guess it was meeting Miss Graham put me in mind of it again. Let me see. Didn't Eleanor Shipley marry one of the Graham boys? I know there was some sort of connection. I think Martha worked for her out at Shipley Farm before she moved to Rest and Be Thankful. Maybe you've heard about it. As I could not very well tell them exactly how I had heard about it, I merely smiled and shook my head and asked for another slice of the... Peggy? Yes, Uncle Enos. I beg your pardon. I wasn't intending. I've been looking for you, said Uncle Enos peevishly. Why aren't you ever around when I want you? That, incidentally, was a fine remark coming from him. Where have you been all day? I went for a ride. Oh, said Uncle Enos, losing interest. The question had been intended simply as a reproof. It's this article I'm writing on 18th century drinking customs for the next issue of Antiques and Collectors, he explained, brushing away the whole subject of the ride with a wave of his hand. I want you to run downstairs for me at once and see just how many bottles those racks in the wine cellar can hold. I've mislaid my note of the exact number, and I never like going down those steep steps myself. It's bad for my rheumatism. Can't you send Petunia? I asked lazily. I had ridden almost 14 miles out and back since morning, and the wine cellar seemed a long way off. Petunia? I shouldn't trust Petunia to count 6 bottles of ginger ale. She's too flighty. You can take her with you to hold the light if you want to. It's dark down there. The wine cellar at Rest and Be Thankful was enormous, built in the days when sherry and claret and port and Madeira and brandy appeared every night on the gentleman's table as a matter of course. Uncle Enos himself never drank anything except a modest cup of hot cocoa at his desk before he went to bed. But he took a certain pride in keeping up all the family traditions, and so the sherry and the claret and port and Madeira and brandy were still there in their long dusty racks, as if waiting forlornly for the jolly old butlers and the liveried men servants who never came any more. It was very dark indeed, and the stairs were even steeper than Uncle Enos had led me to suppose. Cobwebs touched our faces at every step, and unseen creatures ran before our feet with unpleasant scampering noises. It seemed a long time before I finished my count, and then I had to do it all over again because Petunia was so frightened by the darkness and the rustlings that she kept putting me off by giving sudden squeaks of terror and wavering the light with her unsteady hand. 87, 88, Will you keep still, Petunia? 89. If you drop that candle, we'll probably have to stay here all night. 90, 91. Now, we are not going to run back to the stairs. I want to look around a little. It's an interesting place. And since at the bottom of my heart I was actually feeling just as uncomfortable as she was, I took particular pains to saunter slowly and casually back to the door, looking idly about me and asking questions as if I were mildly curious and not especially anxious to leave. What do you keep in there, Petunia? I inquired, making myself pause almost at the cellar steps to point to a queer sort of door, lurking sullenly at a corner, half concealed by the angle of the stairs. It was made of iron grating, like the door of a prison cell, and was fastened on the outside, top and bottom, not only with two long rusty bolts, but a clumsy, large lock as well. I don't know, Miss Peggy, protested Petunia, trying unobstructively to work me on up the steps. You won't find nothing in there. Mr. Enos says it ain't been opened since the Revolution. I went over to the door and tried to lift the upper bolt, which fell with a deep grinding moan. Petunia gave another squeak of terror and almost dropped the candle again. Haunted, she said in a sepulchral whisper. Don't you go in there, Miss Peggy. Nonsense, Petunia. See, there's nothing in here but cobwebs and maybe a few. Ouch! I had stumbled and nearly fallen over a rounded object, half buried in the dust on the floor. It appeared to be a jar of some sort, but had become so caked and encrusted over the years that it was almost unrecognizable. As I straightened up again, I felt a touch on my shoulder, and peering around, saw that I had brushed up against two ugly iron chains suspended from the wall. I could not understand why they had been hung there until I caught sight of an iron ring attached to one of them. They were shackles. Come on out of there, Miss Peggy, before something gets you, wailed Petunia unhelpfully from the doorway. All right, I answered rather shakily. I'm coming. Uncle Enos was back in his study, a jeweler's glass at his eye, examining two antique wine glasses from the corner cabinet of the dining room. The first, Richard Graham was supposed to have brought them back with him from a voyage to Italy when he was a young man. They were lovely things, fragile and as bubbles. One was pale sea green flecked with gold, the other a blazing crimson that was almost scarlet. There was a plunging dolphin curved about the green stem, and a curling snake twisted around the crimson one, both blown with incredible delicacy out of the glass itself. The rest of the desk was covered with old books and papers and masses of untidy notes. Thank you, child, said Uncle Enos with unusual good humor when I made my report. I dislike going down to the cellar. What's that thing you've brought up with you? It looks like a small colonial bean pot. I fell over it in the little room with the grated door and the chains on the wall. Oh, that one? Uncle Enos was already turning back to his desk. Old prison, he informed me absent-mindedly, as he fleed through a pile of notes. First, Enos Graham built it. Used it to scare off Indians. Country still pretty wild around here when he settled. Had a theory they'd never attack the place if they once got the idea it meant being caught and shut up. Never actually put anybody down there as far as I know. Then how do you suppose that the bean pot? Uncle Enos was now thoroughly tired of rewarding me for my good behavior. He reached for a small leather-bound book that lay among the litter of papers and opened it rather as if it were a door through which he was trying to usher me out of the room. "Can't you see I'm busy?" he demanded testily. "Do run along and don't bother me, like a nice child." I did not feel at all like a nice child as I retreated to the library and flung myself passionately down in Dick's big armchair by the fireplace. I hated being a nice child. I did not want to be a nice child. I wanted to be a mean, nasty, horrible shrew and go yell in Uncle Enos's ear until he gave me and told me who he left the bean pot in the cellar. "I overlooked it at the time," replied a matter-of-fact voice from the other side of the room. Very slatternly of me, I confess, but my thoughts were in a state of some confusion, and of course he had Captain Sherwood on our hands too, and as Richard said, he couldn't be trusted even when he was unconscious. It was Barbara Graham again. She had just closed the hall door behind her and was coming forward into the room. She still had on the same long crimson cloak that she wore the first time I met her, and I noticed with a slight feeling of surprise that in spite of the summer heat, the hood was pulled up around her throat and knotted there over a little sprig of pine and red berries, as if it were a cold day in the Christmas season. "Tell me, Peggy," she said, with a sudden delightful smile that made her look like her brother. "Did you find any beans in that pot?" "No, only dust." It looked just like plain or ordinary dust to me, too. The pot must have been scraped clean when it was left in the cellar. Between Dick and Peaceable, I suppose it was. Peaceable always did have such an astonishing fondness for baked beans. She laughed softly as if she were remembering something that entertained her. He used to say that the baked bean was one poetical food New England had ever produced. "Peaceable did?" I repeated in bewilderment. But when did you ever know Peaceable?" "He got away with his men after he was hurt at the Beamer's mill, didn't he? I thought you were over at New Jerusalem with your Aunt Susanna all the time." "Indeed I was," said Barbara Graham, "and a weary time it seemed to me, too. Even when I was a baby, there was nothing I hated quite so much as being taken over to call at Aunt Susanna's house. It was one of those little houses, very small and dark and dismal, where you always feel as if it must be raining outside, no matter what kind of day it is. Dick once told me it smelled of misery, though of course it was really only the damp and the medicine, because I believed every word he said. I must have been about 6 then, and used to sit on the edge of my chair trying to smell the misery myself, until Aunt Susanna thought I was getting a cold in my head and made me drink some horrible black syrup before I went home. Aunt Susanna terrified me. She had fat white fingers, very soft, but with curiously sharp, horny nails that were apt to scratch as she patted me gently on the cheek, and there was a sort of whining edge in her fat, soft voice that could hurt just as badly as the nails did. No matter how hard I tried, I always flinched and shrank whenever she made me sit on her lap. But it was never any use. Aunt Susanna simply held me down with one remarkably powerful hand, while she looked appealingly at my father and said it was really very sad to be so old and ill and burdensome, that even her own little niece couldn't spare a moment out of her happy life to be kind to her poor sick auntie. And then my dear father would feel that he had to talk to me about it very patiently and sweetly all the way home. It was the same old story again many years later, when she coaxed him into closing Rest and Be Thankful and sending me to live with her at New Jerusalem while he and Dick were away with the army. I flinched and shrank. Aunt Susanna talked about her loneliness and her sorrows and her ills while she held me down. My father was very patient and sweet with her, or with me, and it all ended exactly as I had known it would. Unpacking my boxes in the little corner bedroom where, as Aunt Susanna pointed out, you can easily hear me if I happen to be awake in the night and want company. And with that, she told me to fetch another pillow for her head and settled back against it to enjoy herself. I remember the months that followed only as a sort of nightmare of carrying trays and measuring out medicine and answering calls and trying to persuade Aunt Susanna that peaceable Sherwood was very unlikely to burn all New Jerusalem over our heads while we slept. The whole house smelled of misery worse than ever. The cook was exhausted, the kitchen maid sulky, and an underfed, bound-out boy so unhappy that he seemed always to have a sort of mournful drip at the end of his nose. Dick and Eleanor did their best for me, of course, but they had so many troubles of their own that summer, I could hardly ask them to carry mine as well. Aunt Susanna did not care to have me wasting my time on anybody but herself anyway. She was likely to develop terrible fluttering pains that needed all my attention whenever she heard one of my friends asking for me in the hall downstairs, and a simple invitation to a housewarming in November brought on an attack of the vapors that lasted almost a week. Even when I asked if Dick and Eleanor might not come over to spend the afternoon of Christmas Day with me, a request we thought she would not possibly refuse, the words were hardly out of my mouth before she was discovering all sorts of reasons why she could not possibly consent. Come over to spend the afternoon with you? A young unprotected girl ride all that distance alone with no other companion than her brother? Cried Aunt Susanna, as if she were hearing of some hideous scandal. The very idea. They're going to be married just as soon as Father can get leave to come to the wedding, Aunt Susanna. I ventured to remind her wearily. That makes no difference. If Edward Shipley has one spark of proper feeling, he'll keep that daughter of his at home. When I was young, your grandfather would have whipped me soundly and sent me to bed without my dinner for so much as mentioning any such jaunt. I then suggested that instead I might ride over to the Shipley farm myself on Christmas morning and spend the day with Dick and Eleanor there. Aunt Susanna uttered a little shriek of astonishment and disapproval. 10 miles out and 10 miles back again on that forsaken road in all this snow. Have you gone clean crazy, child? She demanded indignantly. Suppose you happen to meet the villain Sherwood. Aunt Susanna, how could I possibly meet the villain Sherwood when he's hiding somewhere up in the hills and hasn't been heard of for months? Dick even thinks he's fled the neighborhood altogether. Won't you let me go, please? Only this once. And leave your poor sick auntie by herself tomorrow, of all days of the year, old and lonely and suffering as she is? In my day, young people were satisfied to stay home and take care of their betters. No, don't argue with me, Barbara. You know how the slightest argument harrows up my nerves. Oh dear, I feel as if one of my bad headaches is coming on already. You'll feel better when I've fetched you your evening gruel, Aunt Susanna. I cut in hastily and got myself out of the room before I completely lost control of my temper. Stamping into the kitchen, I slammed the porringer down on the tray and spoon gruel out of the pot with a viciousness that almost sent it flying in all directions over the floor. My head whirling with furious, crazy plans to get to the Shipley farm, somehow, anyhow. And then Aunt Susanna could say what she liked to me when I came back. She had cheated me out of my home and my comfort and my brother's companionship for the past 8 months. She was not going to cheat me out of Christmas Day with him as well. Yet, even as I stood there raging, I knew in my heart that she not only could, but would. Running away was out of the question. It was impossible to escape from that house. In fact, it was impossible to so much as move from room to room without fatally attracting the attention of Aunt Susanna, who, for all her 65 years and her 27 diseases, had the eye of a hawk and the eye of a lynx and the persistence of a mosquito. Ooh. Of course, she had said upstairs that one of her bad headaches was coming on, and when she really had those headaches, she always took a drug in the morning that sent her to sleep for the rest of the day. But I put no faith in anything Aunt Susanna had said upstairs. I knew all about the bad headaches and the terrible fluttering pains and the dizzy spells that were always coming on, only to vanish mysteriously again as soon as she got her own way. For once, however, Aunt Susanna was apparently telling the truth. I awakened in the dawn with the sound of her shrill voice screaming in my ears, shrieking for her sleeping drops and threatening to die if she did not obtain them immediately. "Couldn't you get here any faster, you lazy, slow-footed, good-for-nothing you?" She welcomed me politely as I appeared in the doorway with her spoon and glass in my hand. "Does anybody in this house care if I perish, or did you all intend to go on resting like the dead until the judgment day?" "I'm sorry, Aunt Susanna," I apologized, holding the glass to her lips, "but we had some difficulty making up the dose. You see, the bottle is nearly empty and—" "Nearly empty? Do you mean that not one of you had the common intelligence to see that it was kept properly filled? Take yourself to the apothecary's while I'm asleep and buy me more. After all, there's no reason why you should sit about the house idling the whole day because I'm not awake to keep an eye on you." "I'll go to the apothecary's after breakfast, and I promise you not to sit about the house idling the whole day, Aunt Susanna," I murmured obediently. Aunt Susanna began another sentence that ended in a snore as I went out of the room, closing the door carefully behind me. I suddenly felt so light-hearted that I almost danced a jig on the doormat, and I broke a little Christmas spray of pine and red berries for my cloak as I stood on the steps waiting for the horse. Even the bound-out boy had begun to whistle faintly when he came up the path from the stable, leading the fat mare, which Aunt Susanna considered the only safe mount for a lady. I was just settling into my saddle when I felt a timid touch on my boot, and glancing down saw that it was an exhausted cook, nervously concealing a small object under her apron. "You going out, Miss Barbara?" she asked in a beaten, toneless voice all the inmates of Aunt Susanna's house fell into the way of using sooner or later. "The mistress wants some medicine from the apothecary's. Hannah and I was planning to go for a ride afterwards. Why? Would you like me to do anything for you?" "If you're sure you don't mind taking it, Miss Barbara. It's only a piece of my special fruit cake to give Mr. Dick, all wrapped up nice to fit into your pocket. Mr. Dick was saying to me the last time he was here that he would sure relish a taste of my fruit cake this Christmas." I stared down at the cook with a little gasp, and the cook stared back up at me without a flicker on her jaded, expressionless, overworked face. "You don't know anything about this, do you, Hannah?" I asked warningly. "I ain't even seen you, miss," retorted Hannah, and marched back into her kitchen again. The fat mare and I ambled together down the road to the apothecary's. We had gone there so often that the apprentice recognized the sound of the hoofbeats and was smiling on the path to receive me before I could even rein in at the door. "Merry Christmas, Miss Barbara," he called to me cheerfully. "And what will it be today? Hartshorn, Seneca oil, Peruvian bark?" "Headache drops," I answered, returning his smile and handing down the bottle. "Will you just ask Mr. Elliot to fill this for Miss Susanna Graham and then fetch it out to me afterwards so I needn't dismount? I'm in a haste today." "And so you should be, Miss Barbara, to go by the looks of that sky." I did not like the looks of that sky myself. A pale silver sun, faint as the moon, was doing its best to break through the haze overhead, but along the whole northern horizon the heavy clouds lay dark and threatening, while an icy wind had already begun to crisp the petals and scurry through the heaps of fallen snow. I studied the clouds rather anxiously as I waited, hoping against hope that the storm would at least hold off till I got out of the Shipley farm. I had often ridden longer distances than 10 miles simply for pleasure, but never in the dead of winter and never on such a broad, stupid, unexercised excuse for a horse. "Here it is, Miss Barbara," said the apprentice, dashing back out of the breath of thrust.
He's out of breath.
"Here it is, Miss Barbara," said the apprentice, dashing back out of breath to thrust a small parcel into my hand. "And please, Mr. Elliot says to tell you that the last supply of that drug was much stronger than the ordinary, so you must reduce the dose from 4 drops to 2 and measure with the most particular care. And he does beseech you to be cautious, because 7 drops will knock a strong man flat, and any more of it he won't answer for the consequences. Tell him I understand. Thank you, Henry, and Happy New Year." "And to you, miss," said the little apprentice, "and if I may presume, don't lose any time getting on to the house. It's going to snow again." It was going to snow again. The sun was already gone and the sky darkening wickedly when I reached the fringes of the village. There were very few people on the road. The one woman who passed me walked hurriedly, glancing over her shoulder at the clouds and dragging a stumbling child sharply by the hand. As we went by the last house, the fat mare gave a disgusted snort, exactly like one of Aunt Susanna's, and sensibly tried to swerve back in the direction of her stable. But I set my jaw and ruthlessly thrust her on. I had made up my mind. After all, I was a strong rider and knew every inch of the way. There were 5 miles of rather rough, difficult going until one got over the hills and came out down by the Tatlock farm. Then almost a mile past Tatlock's cornfields and meadow and pasture land to Martin's Wood, and the left-hand turn there to rest and be thankful. And finally 4 more miles of excellent road winding away up the valley to the Shipley farm. With any luck, the snow ought not to begin for another hour or so. Once I got in, it was welcome to come down as hard as it liked, preferably hard enough to make it impossible for me to go back to New Jerusalem for at least a week. Unfortunately, however, the storm chose instead to break suddenly in full blast just as I got over the hills and rode out down by the Tatlock farm. It came with one tremendous whirling rush of driven ice and razor wind that staggered the fat mar and almost sent me reeling out of my saddle. The next moment we were both floundering desperately in the choking snow and screaming gusts. Dazed and half blinded, I steadied the frantic horse and wildly looked about for the nearest place of shelter. There was none. The familiar country all around had melted and vanished into a swirling whiteness that was like thick fog. Tatlog's cornfields and meadow and pasture land were all gone as if they had never existed. I knew Tatlog's house lay somewhere across the fields to the right, with Hope Goods a quarter of a mile beyond it, but I dared not even try to start towards either of them. I would be hopelessly lost and very likely dead in a ditch 5 minutes after I left the road. Then I thought of going back the way I had come, but going back meant 5 miles against the storm, over slippery rock and dangerous slopes. Too great a risk, even if I had the strength to force my horse directly into the wind. There was nothing to do but press on and trust my luck to reach the Shipley farm sooner or later. The roads were better in that direction, and the gale would be at our backs. I could rest the fat mar a while in the cover of Martin's Wood. It was only a mile away. It was a hideous journey, and it seemed to go on for hours. The wind beat and tore at us incessantly. My hands became so stiff with cold that I could hardly keep hold of the reins. The wild torrents of snow were suffocatingly thick. It was still almost impossible to see. At any moment we might have lurched over a smothered rock or gone off the road altogether. The fat mar stumbled and sobbed. Careful down there, old girl," I tried to encourage her, and I wished to heaven I'd taken your advice back at New Jerusalem, if that's any satisfaction to you. "Can't you get along any faster, you lazy, slow-footed, good-for-nothing," as Aunt Susanna would say. "We must be fairly near Martin's Wood now."